This is episode 636 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing. I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Patrick McLaughlin. He is Director of Policy Analytics at the Mercatus Center. He's a senior research fellow there, and the Mercatus Center is at George Mason University. We are going to be talking about his new report, or a report that he helped author with regard to state level regulatory policies. So, welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Patrick.
Thanks, Paul. It's my pleasure to be on.
Yeah, well, had a good meeting with you and some of your colleagues out in Arizona. And, I had read through your new report, Snapshots of State Regulations, 2024 edition. It was published back on August 6th of this year. And you co-authored this report on behalf of the Mercatus Center. And we're going to go through data on state regulations, how New Mexico stacks up, and what we can do to right-size our regulatory bureaucracy. But why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and the Mercatus Center as way of an introduction?
Sure. So the Mercatus Center, as you said, we're at George Mason University, and we do a lot of economics research, research in some other areas, but really our primary mission is not necessarily producing the new research. It's bridging the gap, so to speak, between the academics who are coming up with new ideas that could be used in policy situations and the policymakers themselves. So it's a lot of communication. It's a lot of taking that research, which again, sometimes we make, sometimes we don't, and getting it in the hands of policymakers to try to make the world a better place, see if we can offer some new solutions. And then I came on to Mercatus several years ago with a job of trying to improve regulatory policy overall. And this led to early on the identification of a lack of understanding of just even how much regulation there is. And that led to this project that you mentioned earlier, Paul, the RegData project. I've been running this for many years at the federal level. The basic idea here is there's a lot of regulation out there. This is self-evident. If you look at just the number of books of regulation at the federal level or in different states, you can see them accumulating over the years. But we don't know really what's in those books. And so I tried to devise ways of using text analysis, computer programs, machine learning, these days some large language models and AI to read through all this text and measure how much regulation is there, who's affected by it, and what does that mean for the economy.
Got it. So let's dive into this report a little bit. First and foremost, you mentioned some of that AI technology and the other methods. And we talked about this a little bit in person, but as far as your methodology, you looked at basically the number of regulations as an aggregate number, or can you explain any nuance there? But basically, it's a sheer number of regulations as you wrote this report, correct?
Basically correct. And one starting point here is ask what is a regulation, and there's not a good definition of that. People will think of a new rulemaking. So a little bit of a term of art there. A rulemaking is when an agency, say in New Mexico or in DC, decides they're going to make a new set of words that's going to go on the books that's going to either obligate you to do stuff or prohibit you from doing stuff. They will call that a rulemaking. That will go into the set of rules that are already on the books. And so that's where all the regulations are housed. But what's a regulation really? Is it those obligations and prohibitions? Is it the number of rulemakings? Is it the number of sections and chapters in all these books? So I had to define this really. And so early on, what we did in this project is, all right, let's define within this text what we're actually measuring. So I settled on prohibitions and obligations. So that's what you say, there's a number of regulations, what we're measuring. It's basically it's number of prohibitions and obligations that are in the text of regulations in New Mexico and all the other states are at the federal level. And so now we have a number that people can really sort of wrap their heads around. You want to get into the numbers?
Well, let me tackle it this way. One of the notable things I think is in your report that there's no real red state, blue states, major theme there. Uh, in fact, if I was to look at the most regulated versus the least regulated, the most regulated states tend to be uh, big states in population.
Yeah.
So started with California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, and Texas. New Mexico, by the way, comes in 19th, so we're not exactly at the bottom. We're certainly punching above our weight when you look at our population size,
Right.
which is in the 30s. The lowest regulated states are from least to most is Idaho, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, and Alaska. Obviously, some of the lesser populated states in the country. Is there something that you pinpointed or could figure out when it comes to population size that just you inevitably get more regulations regardless of kind of the more the character of the state or let's target that one real quick.
Yeah, I think the word I would use is natural, but not inevitable. So yeah, I do think as states grow in population or just age overall, as states are established at different points in time, you generally see more regulatory agencies get created. And as agencies are made, you'll then see them making more regulations. And this is sort of a natural process. Explaining why that happens, that would require a whole other set of research. You could have some sort of public choice angle here, you could have some good governance angle here, who knows, but it does seem to occur. We see this correlation between population and total regulation. We also see a correlation between age of states and total regulation. It's not inevitable, and
By
so
age
that's
of states, you mean the literal date when they became a U.S. state, not the population age.
correct. I mean the literal date when it became a
Okay.
state. So the farther west you go, right, you're generally running into younger states, and so we also see that pattern bear out in the numbers. Um, but the while this is natural, it's not inevitable, and this is something that's worth dwelling on. Just because regulations tend to accumulate in correlation with population doesn't mean that's a good thing. And we have seen now in several states that you can go back and re-examine some of the old regulations that are on the books, and maybe they aren't worth keeping. And you've seen some states buck the trend, so to speak. They aren't necessarily holding to this population and regulation correlation because they devise processes to go back and re-examine old rules and get rid of what they're calling, and what I agree with, is called red tape, stuff that just creates cost but no benefits.
What are some states that do that effectively, and what do they actually do? So let's get into the kind of that ways that you can avoid just being consumed by red tape.
Yeah. Well, so let's, before we even go into that, maybe we should
Okay.
talk about what it means to be consumed by red tape. So this is because this is one of the points of this whole project, to be able to measure how much regulation there is. It does let us compare states and who's more regulated and less regulated and see things like the correlation between population and regulation, but it also lets us study the effects of it. And I like to make an analogy to medical science. So before we knew about how cholesterol, for example, affected heart health, people suspected, and this is 200 years ago or more. People suspected that cholesterol would have some sort of effect on your heart, but we didn't have good metrics, didn't have good ways of measuring it. Eventually, that science evolved to the point where you could measure it, and then we're able to study precisely how does cholesterol affect your heart. And then the metrics got even better, right? We divided up into high density and low density lipoproteins, I think was what L stands for there. Different types of cholesterol, some of which are good, some of which are bad, and we got more nuanced in our science. But that's only by developing measurement that we're able to then understand the effects. So similarly with reg data, well, now that we can measure how much regulation there is, who's creating it, what industries and parts of the economy are affected by it, we're able to see what happens when you let red tape build up in, say, New Mexico or any of the other states. So just real quick on this, Paul, there's a lot of research that's been done using the data, but what we can say conclusively is there's consistent evidence that more red tape, more regulation slows economic growth. This is sort of self-evident, but now we're able to put numbers on it. So we've seen in some states, or rather countries, and even in provinces in Canada, that if you don't go back and cut red tape, you're basically sacrificing 1 percentage point of growth per year. And that could be massive, but it's also an opportunity. It means you could gain that back if you do go back and cut some red tape. You also see things like higher poverty rates, lost jobs, fewer jobs created in states that are more regulated, higher inflation. And again, this is one of those things that also people kind of intuitively understand. Of course, more regulation means higher prices, but now we're able to put numbers on that and say, all right, just how much does that matter for inflation overall? So those are just some points I wanted to highlight before we go into why, how you can go back and red tape. Here's why it's worth cutting red tape.
Sure. Real quickly before we leave that, first and foremost, it's worth noting and just looking at this a little more detail. California does have the most regulations, and it's not really close. I mean, you're talking
Yeah.
about a 25% or more difference between even just California and New York, which not exactly a stark difference there in politics. Most people consider those to be the two biggest states, and the left leading states, one West Coast, one East Coast. But boy, California really does kind of lap the field when it comes to regulations. Uh, you do have Texas at fifth, Florida at 11th. So it's not like every red state is just really uh, knocking it out of the ballpark, at least when it comes to the number of regulations. Arizona's down at 43, so their
Mm-hmm.
regulatory burden is far lower than New Mexico, which is uh, expected considering we were territorial. We were part of the same territory way back in pre 1912. But do you see kind of economic trends with just the total number of regulations, like in your report, or do you have to dive into some of the most expensive regulations in any given state and say those are the ones that are really holding X, Y, and Z states back?
Oh no, it's more of the former. You can see the trends, the differences between the states that have more regulation in their growth rates, economic growth rates, and the states that have less. Or more specifically, I did this examination when I put together this year's data. I divided the states up into two groups. One group is states that have not actively developed some sort of red tape reduction or re-examination of existing regs process, states that aren't going back and changing things and just letting the status quo maintain, versus the states that have done that. So there's 9 states that have gone through these reforms, and then the rest of the states that have not. And you look at their growth rates, and this is pretty high level stuff. We're just looking at total regulation and whether you're on this status quo trend or not, and then growth. And there's this difference, an evident, it's just self-evident difference in the growth rates between these two sets of states. If you were to take, so I think the numbers are, I don't have it right in front of me, but it's about uh, the average growth rate for the states that have gone through the reform process is about 2.05% annually. That's the growth rate. And then the states that have not, it's about 1.85% annual growth, which seems like a small difference, right? 2/10 of a percentage point. But when you're talking about economic growth, if you have a 2/10 of a difference in percentage point difference year after year, it doesn't take that many years before that one group that's ahead has outstripped by a lot the other group. So you even see this just at a high level, just looking at growth rates alone, when you separate the states into these two different categories. If you want to go into details, there's studies that do. I mean, economists love to really get deep on control for other relevant factors like tax rates and population and everything else. And everyone who has done that has seen that the states that do cut red tape experience better economic growth overall.
Got it. Yeah. Well, it makes sense. And I know this is looking at the overall numbers more or less, but it does, I think, intuitively make sense that if you have a lot of regulations on the books and don't make specific efforts to address that regulatory buildup, then you're kind of going to fall further and further into that the pile of red tape, so to speak, to take the metaphor a little bit further.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think one example really helps to highlight the both the consequence of ignoring it and the opportunity that New Mexico, say, has in front of it for gaining economic growth by re-examining red tape, and that's British Columbia. So the province in Canada, back in 2001, they really pioneered the idea of going back and looking at regulations and seeing do we really need all this? And this was instigated by somewhat by crisis. In the 90s, that province had pretty dismal economic growth overall. It underperformed compared to all the other provinces in Canada in most years. And so a new government was elected in 2001, partly on the platform of cutting regulation in order to boost economic growth. And this is a fairly liberal in the American political sense of the word province in Canada. So this is not like a red province, blue province situation at all. This was a new government elected on the basis of, hey, our economy is doing horrible. Let's do whatever we can to fix things. So they got
Yeah.
into office. They decided to try to fulfill their campaign promise of cutting regulations by 1/3. And they did that. They did that within 3 years. They cut regulations by actually nearly 40%. And as a result, and I've got a study out there that shows this, the growth rate in the province improved by over 1 percentage point. It's about 1.2 percentage points from cutting red tape, precisely from that. Like that's a causal effect here. So that's the kind of thing. And the way that they did it has now been emulated by several other states and other provinces. So we're finally looping back to the question you had earlier. How do you go about cutting red tape? British Columbia sort of spearheaded that too and thought about how can we accomplish this goal of cutting 1/3, or in their case, more than 1/3.
Yeah, and for folks who may not know where British Columbia is, it is the major West Coast province in Canada. It's where Vancouver, Canada is. So, yeah, so it's not just limited though to Canada and British Columbia. They may have
Mm-hmm.
kind of kicked off a province or state level effort when it comes to regulatory reform. Let's talk about the specifics now.
Yep.
How do you get regulatory red tape under control?
Yep. So as you say, British Columbia did it first, but other states have done it. And the places that we've seen be most effective at it have essentially used regulators themselves as the people who would accomplish the cutting. So the idea here is it is a fair amount of work to go back and look through what New Mexico's case, 138,000 different regulations and figure out which ones you can cut, because you don't want to get rid of stuff that is actually accomplishing good, right? You want to get rid of stuff that's truly red tape, stuff that's not
Right.
creating benefits, but it has some cost. So who's going to do that work? You don't want to necessarily create a new office, hire new employees for all of this. Maybe you do, maybe you have the budget for that, but most states don't. And so what British Columbia did and what other states since then, like Idaho, Virginia, Ohio, have done is put this on the hands of regulators themselves. They're the experts. So let's let the experts on their own regulations go back and figure out which of their own regulations they can cut. And it doesn't suffice to just say, go and do this. You have to create some sort of incentive. You have to either tell regulators that if they want to make new regulations, that's fine because they do have a job to do. They have a mission, whatever that mission may be. Sometimes that requires making new regulations. But if you want to do that, you have to go back and find an old regulation, or in British Columbia's case, go back and find two old regulations that you can get rid of. So that's one way to just change the incentives of regulators themselves so that
Is
they
that a
now have the
regulatory
job.
budget? Is that kind of what you're talking about there? One in,
Yeah,
one
yeah.
out, or one
That
in,
that
two out?
is. Yeah,
Okay.
so that's a form of a regulatory budget. And so you can do that using regulations like prohibitions and obligations, like we're measuring with reg data. And so for every new prohibition or every new obligation, you have to get rid of an old one. And that's what British Columbia did.
Okay.
Instead of an alternative approach here for budgeting, regulatory budgeting is let's monetize this. Let's figure out the costs of the old regulations. And for the new regulations that you make, let's figure out the cost of it. And you have to offset the cost of the new one by getting rid of, some number of old ones. It might be one or it might be more than one that offsets the cost. That's a more expensive process. That's what you did see done at the federal level under President Trump for a few years. But at the state level, we're generally seeing the simpler approach where you just, instead of monetize it and look at costs, you just look at requirements or obligations, and for every new one that you make, get rid of one or two or three old ones. So that's part of it.
Now,
Another,
that Trump did something like that at the federal level. Would you agree, or what kind of nuance would you have there when it comes to President Trump and his regulatory policies?
yeah, it was very similar. It was arguably inspired by British Columbia, but in DC you have a whole regulatory system that relies on cost benefit analysis. This apparatus already exists, and so the Trump administration had to sort of fit their reform into the existing paradigm, into the way of thinking that it's already there in the agencies, and amongst the experts that surround the DC bubble, such that it is. So they had to monetize it. I don't think there's any other way around it at the federal level. What they did was what I was describing earlier. When there's a new regulation made, figure out the cost of it and offset the cost by getting rid of or modifying two or more old regulations. And so that was sort of a one in, two outs. That's what people think of when they think of the Trump administration's regulatory budget, one in, two out. But the details were really offset the cost of the new one by modifying at least two old ones. It wasn't
Okay.
necessarily getting rid of them entirely. But the downside of that, while there's a lot of appeal to knowing the cost and like sort of offsetting the impact of new ones by equal impact old ones, it's just costly in the sense that it takes experts. It takes a lot of time to produce the analyses that are going to have these cost estimates that you can hopefully rely on for running the budget. So that's why I think at the state level, you just haven't seen that sort of thing crop up. Most states aren't producing cost estimates of all new rules, let alone have cost estimates for the old rules.
Got it. So you were
So
about to say something else. Yeah, another mechanism, right?
yep, another mechanism. So besides the one in, two out, or one in, one out part of the budget, something else we saw in British Columbia and the other states have been emulating is start things off with a crash diet, so to speak. Like that the regulatory accumulation has happened for years in your state or in your province or at the federal level even, and it's maybe not sufficient to just hope that a one in, one out, for example, budget is going to fix the problem. You probably need to trim some excess weight, so to speak. You need to cut red tape. And so British Columbia set that target initially they said, we're going to have a one in, two out regulatory budget. But on top of that, all the regulators need to go and find enough regulations that we can cut it by at least a third. We've seen other states follow suit. Virginia and Ohio are targeting 25 and 30% reductions. They want to accomplish that within 3 or 4 years, depending on which state we're talking about. So it's not just one in, one out, or one in, two out. It's on top of that, an initial push to get rid of some of the low hanging fruit, some of the red tape that's just obviously red tape. And they've been very successful at doing that too. I mean, you can see this bearing out in the numbers. If you look at the states that have implemented this sort of program, that have started off with this sort of targeted red tape reduction, 25%, 30%, or whatever the number may be, you can see that those states are starting to go down in the rankings of how regulated there are. You can see the percentage decrease from year to year. So that's also a very effective strategy. So I think the way that I would do this, if I could just wave a magic wand and change regulatory policy in any state, it would be start off with a targeted red tape reduction. I think 25 or 30% is fine. Pick a number though. And then follow that with some sort of better maintenance system where for every new regulation you make, you have to re-examine some old ones and find one or two to get rid of. And that will keep you at a healthier level, so to speak, to extend the medical analogy.
Got it. Those are two, I think, obviously worthwhile approaches. Did you look at any other ways of addressing overregulation that have been tried? Maybe not as successful, but obviously regulations are a pretty broad area, so it can easily be kind of maybe certain things targeted at certain areas of the economy. Like New Mexico is a
Mm-hmm.
very energy intensive state. That's obviously a federal and state priority is regulating things like air quality and whatnot. Did any states do anything with energy that was worthwhile, or some other specific areas of the economy?
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up. I think especially in New Mexico, where it may be harder to get some sort of broad reform accomplished, and probably many other states in this group. But I think we saw in Virginia under the previous governor, who was a Democrat, an example of ways that you can get started that can garner bipartisan support. So in Virginia, in 2018 or 2019, they decided this, but the legislature came up with an approach to try to improve the state of occupational licensing and criminal justice in Virginia. And there are two offices in Virginia that are responsible for those sections of regulation, occupational licensing and criminal justice. And so Virginia decided they're going to do this pilot approach. They're going to target just those two agencies and require those agencies themselves to go back and re-examine their rules. And they had a target there too for this pilot program, 25% reduction in stuff that they don't need. Let's get rid of 25% of occupational licensing, or of the useless crimes that are out there that are just creating victims, so to speak, the people that get convicted of crimes when there's not really any harm done. Is there a way we can get rid of some of that stuff? And so that was very successful. And that was, again, bipartisan legislation that was signed by a Democratic governor. And it sort of demonstrated that this is a path forward. You can do a targeted pilot program in some specific area. I don't know of any in energy, by the way, but in some specific area that can maybe demonstrate both the efficacy of this approach as well as the lack of negative consequence, right? You get rid of some regulations and people worry that the sky will fall, so to speak. That didn't happen in Virginia. It was only positive. And then that led to subsequent expansion of this program to all regulations, not just those narrow areas.
Yeah, obviously Virginia, at least under Northam,
Right.
he's a Democrat guy. Idaho is another state you cite. Even though there's really, I don't see it. Maybe you see it, a partisan trend with regard to regulations in your report. Uh, what what does kind of spur blue state governors to decide that regulations are an issue, and red state governors alike? Is there a unifying trend? Are they doing things for different reasons? Are blue state governors acting differently for different reasons than red state, or what's kind of is there a through line there?
It might be too early to draw conclusions here. I do think that the wave of regulatory reform that's spreading across the states is still pretty early in the process, right? We've only got my list only includes 9 states that have done this. I will say most of those states have been run by red, Republicans at the governor level and sometimes in the legislature. So that might be a trend, but I don't know that it's defined by politics necessarily. I like to think that it's defined by competition between states. There's some, there will be, well, you guys, you're next to Arizona. You probably know quite a bit about Governor Ducey's reforms that he pulled off in Arizona. And a lot of the motivation for cutting back on red tape in Arizona was we want to outperform California. And so competition between states often instigates some sort of attempt for a governor to say go back and cut red tape. Same thing, you see these talking points in Virginia. Virginia's governor, current governor, Governor Youngkin, really wants to make sure that Virginia is the place that businesses choose to locate as opposed to the states that are next door. So it's not strictly red or blue. It's more of competition between the states that I see the driving the trend.
Sure. Yeah. It's no, it's interesting because, of course, and feel free to correct me if you think I'm wrong. We've seen in my lifetime two presidents that I think really took on regulations in a coherent way, Donald Trump and Jimmy Carter. And
Yeah.
if you can come up with two more kind of generally speaking, ideologically disparate folks that have been president of the United States, it would be hard to do. I mean, I don't think Carter governed as much of a left winger as he kind of became that in both the left and the right visions of who he was. But he certainly took on the regulatory state, and of course, Donald Trump also really did tackle regulations in a coherent fashion. And so there are both left wing and right wing arguments for right sizing regulations. It's just a matter of making them politically saleable in the relevant states.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, President Carter arguably did it out of necessity because the inflation was so bad for so long and the economy was suffering. And it was similar to the British Columbia story, in the sense that they had to come up with solutions, and deregulation was an obvious solution. And it's worth pointing out that this is a low cost solution, right? You don't have to worry about the effect on the budget. This isn't some sort of let's subsidize this industry so that they can do better in the short run or something like that. This is no, we purely cut back in costs that are dragging down the economy, but there's not a big line item on the state's budget or the country's budget that corresponds to it.
Right.
And, Carter was arguably the first great deregulator. Reagan gets some credit for what Carter did, but it all started under Carter.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we can do this in New Mexico. It's right now it's tough because we have such a massive oil and gas surplus that there's not really that budgetary pressure to act at the state level. But there's no reason that we can't do it. And one of the interesting nuances, New Hampshire and Vermont. I mean, outside of perhaps New Mexico and Arizona, it's hard to find states that have less in common ideologically that share a border. And New Hampshire actually is right above New Mexico, 18th in regulation. Oh, so this is correct. So I was confused but New Hampshire does do a better job, which they're a low tax state. They're a economically dynamic state in New England, where it's Vermont, more heavily regulated. So they are 37. So they're more heavily regulated in Vermont. I guess that's not a surprise there.
Yeah.
But
I think it's probably worth mentioning. There's other approaches that a state can consider that are maybe less abrasive, I guess, for lack of a better word here, than the idea of deregulation or cutting red tape. So I think just overall, most states should consider improving the regulatory process. And so I talked about how you can do that in sort of a regulatory budget framework, right? And even within a narrow section, like in Virginia, we talked about occupational licensing and criminal justice as the starting point for a regulatory budget. But there's other things that can be done. And just, briefly, maybe I should run through some of those before we run out of time, because I think New
sure,
Mexico is the kind of place where you should think about all possible ideas here. One thing, speaking of Democratic presidents, President Obama pushed agencies to re-examine their rules a lot, and some of them did. And so this wasn't a highly touted success story, but Obama wanted the regulators to go back and do what they called retrospective review and figure out where they could cut red tape. there wasn't a whole lot of teeth to this executive order. It wasn't necessarily enforced, but some agencies did this. They just, at the president's behest, they went back and they started looking back at old rules and seeing what they can improve upon. So it wasn't a total failure. There was some success there, and some states could do better there too, just by an executive order from the governor saying to the regulators, do what you can where you can. You're not necessarily going to lose your job if you don't, but let's at least start the process of re-examining old rules. You know, Socrates supposedly said the unexamined life is not worth living, which, by the way, I do not ascribe to at all, but I will say the unexamined regulation may not be worth keeping. Let's try to at least re-examine them. So that's one. Another is, what do you do about new regulations? Ideally, you want to analyze them, look at costs and benefits, potential costs and benefits. As I said earlier, that is an expensive process, but even a streamlined process where a new regulation has some examination of alternatives. So regulators will often get stuck on a single approach, a single idea for solving a problem. But if they examine multiple approaches, multiple ideas, you can sometimes find a more cost-effective solution. And so I would say at least having an alternatives analysis, if not a full-blown cost-benefit analysis for all new rules, can go a long way to making more efficient choices. Another thing is permitting transparency. And so in New Mexico, this is probably really important given the energy focus of the state. You know, a lot of new energy projects will require permitting from various agencies at the local, state, and federal levels. What we've seen in other places, especially I'm going to point back to Virginia, where you do make that process more transparent, the whole permitting process does seem to go faster. So transparency here just means create a website that will tell you where the permit application is, which agency is looking at it, how long is it taking at that agency, and that can just instigate some action, make things move faster. So just a few other ideas. There's a lot that can be done to improve the process.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for all of this information. And hopefully we will in New Mexico get serious about regulatory reform issues. Obviously, that oil and gas surplus kind of softens the blow for politicians. They don't feel like we need to act because we're just riding that oil and gas revenue. But of course, we are one of the poorest states in the country in terms of our population, so we could do a lot better with our regulatory approach. So I appreciate the information, and of course, a link to the excellent report will be included in the show notes for folks to go and check out themselves. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.